Okay, welcome back to chapter 8 as we're now, of course, looking at the Trinity this semester. And today we're looking at Jesus Christ and what it means when we say, in our creed, that He is the true God. And so a lot to unpack here today as we think about this particular topic. One of the things I think is real important to say at the beginning is one of the things that's questioned a lot today by people is the reality of Christ. You hear a lot of people, particularly in the 1900s, start talking about this idea of the historical Jesus. So this idea that there's like a historical Jesus, and then there's this Jesus that all these crazy Christians have this faith in, and that there's this, there's this kind of this separate track of who Jesus really was versus who the gospel writers made Jesus out to be and who the early church made Jesus out to be. As we sort of painted this picture that wasn't true of Jesus, and that if you look hard enough and you dig enough in archaeological places or you read enough manuscripts, you'll find out there's this other Jesus. And that gets really, the archaeology and all those other things are very important. Those are good things. They can tell us a lot about and help us understand the Bible a lot better. But if we think that it starts to show us that the church or the apostles or somebody else made up something about Jesus, that the Gospels are not, telling us everything that's true and are inspired, then we get into a lot of trouble. And I think that it gets into this heresy that's always a temptation in a lot of the heresies you see is either people emphasizing that Jesus is fully divine or erring on that side and saying, well, He was more divine than He was human, or people erring on the other side and saying, He was more human and not necessarily divine or not as divine as we make Him out to be. And so those kind of things. So the reason we do all that is that because if these things are true, if Jesus isn't really fully human and fully divine, like the church says, and if there are things that the early church made up about Jesus, or that the apostles made up about Jesus, well then people can come in and say, well, if that's the case, if He meant this, or the historical Jesus did this, but then the church dressed it up and made it like this, then people can come back and say, so we can actually say what God meant here. You can go back in then and say, well, it's all up for grabs, right? Everything that Jesus did, everything that Jesus said is up for grabs because, He didn't really, some of it's, if any of it, basically is sort of deceptive or was an add-on or wasn't true, then it's all not true. So we can go in and kind of interpret everything however we want, if we don't trust the Gospels fully to tell us and give us the truth about who Jesus is. And so again, I think a lot of times this searching for this historical Jesus, this parsing out, what was really happening versus what the church said or what the Gospel said, is really because people want to go back in and say that we can then make up our other things on our own and do things our own way, okay? So, the Christ that we know about from history, the Jesus Christ who walked the earth, and the stories of His life are told in the Gospels, that is the second person of the Trinity, okay? That is Jesus Christ, and so the second person of the Trinity and the man are the same person, okay? And they're not separable, and it's real important that we understand that. We say that He has two natures, so He has His divine nature and He has this human nature, but that they are fused in one person. Okay, so it's one person that has two natures present in that one person. Okay, so the natures are human and divine, but it's only one person. You can't say, no one would have walked up, the apostles couldn't have walked up to Jesus and said, hey, now that we're talking to earthly Jesus, but we want to speak to the other Jesus, the divine Jesus, right? It was all one. Divine Jesus and human Jesus, two natures, but they're present there in one person, in the person of Jesus of Nazareth, okay? How do we know Jesus Christ is also God? What can we use? And the biggest proof, really, for that, for the early Christians, certainly, and hopefully for us too, is the resurrection. It even says elsewhere in the Gospels, that people talk about all these other people that, had claimed to be God or had said they were, but when they died, that their movement sort of fizzled out, and no one knew, it died, the movement died, right? With the resurrection, Jesus said, hey, I'm going to come back, and He did. He came back from the dead, right? And then He walked amongst His apostles. There was a lot of he didn't just appear to a couple people, he appeared to a lot of people, a lot of the apostles, all the apostles, right? And a lot of other people in the early church as well. He appears to St. Paul and knocked, with the whole story of the lightning and the knocking off the horse, the flashing light, all that kind of thing, okay? So, if Jesus hadn't resurrected, everyone would have gone home, most likely, right? I mean, everyone would have been like, crushed. The guy that we had followed that said he was going to save us and save the world and said he was God, he died on the cross and he's gone. He never came back. And so his movement would have fizzled out, right? Now, the only other opportunity there, if you're going to take that line, is to say, well, people might say, well, what happened was the apostles, Jesus died on the cross, and then the apostles made all this up to make themselves feel better. That they made up this whole Christianity thing. They made up the resurrection in order, to console themselves because, Jesus said he was going to come back, so the apostles just made it up. But if you have to think about this. Like a bunch of fishermen and women who had no money put together a plan that would lead to all of them being killed. So all the apostles, right? All the apostles are put to death for following Jesus, for going out and proclaiming the resurrection of Christ. Their lives were hard. They were travelers. They were on the road. They lived lives of poverty, right? They had no power. They had no great, nothing along those lines, right? They had nothing that we would look at and be like, wow, that would have been awesome to be, an apostle in the sense of earthly pleasures and so forth, okay? So going out and saying that, so that hundreds of years later, people they would never know would have some semblance of power, right? So, they said, let's make all this up. We'll suffer for it. We'll be put to death for it and live lives really of great toil and misery and suffering and be put to death for this, so that Constantine, 300 years later, could be the emperor and a Christian, or so that the Pope, whoever, in the year 1000, could sort of rule over the church and have this influence in the world. No, that's crazy. I mean, they wouldn't have done that, right? They just didn't have the ability. They didn't have that would be really nefarious, right? Really scheming and just not possible, right? This doesn't seem possible to me. So, anyway, the divinity of Christ. What does it mean to say that Jesus Christ is the Son of God? Okay, so we talk about some of these things. Christ existed with the Father before time. Okay, so from the very beginning, Christ has always existed with the Father, sharing in the Father's substance. Now, what we mean by that, again, we talked about the Trinity, 3 persons and 1 substance, 1 God. Okay, so we say consubstantial, we mean that the Father and the Son shared substance. They shared the same substance, even though they're 2 persons. Okay. Now with Christ, again, as I was saying at the beginning, we have 2 natures. So we have the divine nature of Christ and we have the human nature of Christ coming together in 1 person. Okay, Jesus of Nazareth. Now, we call that 2 natures in 1 person the hypostatic union. Okay, hypostatic union, 2 natures in 1 person. Okay, I remember a nun when I was growing up in class, we had to drill that into us, right? So that's a weird word, but it describes really clearly this idea, again, 2 natures in 1 person. Now, the human nature of Christ gives him what? A human soul. Christ has a human intellect and a human will. Alongside that, it's really important to know that he also has a divine intellect and a divine will. The will is that thing that chooses things, right? And so he has, as for his choosing muscle, he has both a divine will and a human will of his own from his human nature, just like you and I have, right? He also has this intellect that you and I have as a human person, but he also has that intellect that comes from being God. And so there's a real beautiful, there's a lot to reflect on there in the sense that, how does that happen? How do you have 2 wills? And what we believe there is that very beautifully, that when he takes his human will becomes united with the divine will perfectly. And that's two becoming 1, right? He gives his intellect to the divine intellect, right? His human intellect and divine intellect become 1. And that's what you and I are called to do as well. We're called to take our will and allow it to be conformed to what it is that God God's will, right? And so Jesus does this perfectly. He has a human intellect and a human will, and a divine intellect and a divine will, but they melt together perfectly because his human nature is given over completely and allows and trusts and puts his trust in the Father, right? In God, such that the two wills that are present and the two intellects that are present in him become one, just like you and I are called to do as well. So may our wills be conformed to God's too. Now, does Christ say he is divine? And that's really interesting, right? It's real important to know. He does. He says this a lot in the Gospels. He tells everyone he was sent by the Father. He talks about the Father 20 times in John's Gospel as he who sent me, okay? At the baptism of Jesus, we see this. This is my beloved Son in whom I am well pleased. There are all these times where we're seeing Jesus being described as, or Jesus claiming himself to be, the Son of God or the Father. Christ affirms his equality with God by teaching on his own authority, right? That was real important to Jews in a particular way. Jesus teaches with this new authority, and you even hear people saying that in the Gospel sometimes. They say, this one teaches differently than all the other teachers we've had. He teaches of his own authority. And so, and Jesus claims that authority for himself when he's teaching. He says, this is, I'm teaching this on my own, of my own authority that the Father has given to me, right? And so that would have been a very bold move. Christ also does something very bold. He forgives sins, right? And only God can do that. People notice that too. People said, only God is supposed to be forgiving sins. This guy's forgiving sins too. And so they saw in that Christ making a very bold statement and saying, I am God, okay? Christ also says he will judge the world, which we all know is only something that God does. And so Christ is saying again very clearly, I am God. A fifth way is that he accepts when people come and praise him as God and offer him worship and sacrifices and etc. He accepts that. He doesn't say, no, I'm not God. He says, you're right. This is a good thing to do. What you're doing right now, you're honoring me because I am God. C.S. Lewis had something very beautiful to say about Christ that I think is super important when we think about these kind of things. When we think about historical Jesus and all these kind of, how does his human nature... Jesus went around, it's really important to say, Jesus went around telling everyone he was God, okay? And so C.S. Lewis, who never converted to Catholicism, but I read a great book one time, talked about how, he was very much in love with the Catholic Church in almost every area, and has a lot to say that is very Catholic, even though he never converted. And this is just a great point, whether you're Catholic or not. So he says, a man who said the sort of things Jesus said would not be a great moral teacher. He would either be a lunatic, okay, on the level with the man who says he is an egg, okay, so if you went around and said you were an egg, right, you'd be crazy. So Jesus is going around making these claims about himself. Either he's crazy or else he would be the devil, right? He would either be crazy or the devil of hell. Now, C.S. Lewis says, you and I, we must make our choice. Either this Christ was and is the Son of God, or else a madman, or the devil, right? So he's either crazy, or the devil, or he is who he says he is, okay? And so it says, see, he goes on, you can shut him up for a fool, so you can say he's a fool. You can spit at him and kill him as if he's the demon, or you can fall at his feet and call him Lord and God. But let us not come with any patronizing nonsense about his being a great human teacher. He has not left that open to us. He did not intend to. It seems to me obvious that he was neither a lunatic nor a fiend of hell, and consequently, however strange or terrifying or unlikely it may seem, I have to accept the view that he was and is God. So very beautiful. I think C.S. Lewis lays out those three options. Either he's from a demon, he's crazy, or he is who he says he is. And he says very clearly a lot of things. He does not just come to teach things, although he does teach, right? He comes and makes some very bold claims about himself. And so I think we have to reckon with that. So some questions about this chapter. How would you answer the question from a friend? Yeah, there's the Jesus Gospels, but then there's what we know about Jesus from history, right? Every year around Christmas and Easter, there's always articles about something that they found about Jesus, or digging in a dirt pile, or Mary, Jesus was actually, maybe Jesus was actually married, the Da Vinci Code and all this stuff. How would you answer that criticism? Okay, yeah, there's the Jesus of the Gospels, but then there's what we know about Jesus from history. What would you say in response to that? Number two, if someone asked you about the evidence we have for the resurrection of Christ, what would you say? Number three, what is the hypostatic union? Number four, what happens if people think God was more human or more divine? What kind of trouble do we get into if we think that, well, Jesus was more human or more divine, et cetera, et cetera? What does that lead to? Number five, did Christ identify himself as God? Number six, how many intellects does Christ have? This is a four-parter. How many wills does Christ have? How many natures does Christ have? And how many persons does Christ have? Again, how many intellects, how many wills, how many natures, and how many persons? And then finally, number seven, what does the word consubstantial mean? What does the word consubstantial mean? Okay, that concludes our class for the day. Hope you're doing well. Have a blessed week, and we will see you next time.